John Perkins, welcome to the West Coast Truth.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
John, for the audience, what is an economic hitman? What exactly is it that you have done?
Russell, I think it's fair to say that we economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire. And it's the first empire in history that's been created primarily without the military, through economics. And I guess it'd be fair to say that we work in many different ways, but the most common is that we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, for example, and then arrange huge loans to that country from the World Bank and its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country, things like power plants and industrial parks that benefit a few of the very wealthy families in the country, as well as our own corporations, which are the main beneficiaries. But these projects don't help the majority of the people at all. Most of the people are too poor to buy electricity. They can't get jobs in industrial parks because industrial parks don't hire many people. And yet the people of the country, are left holding a huge debt. It means that they're not able to get proper education systems or water or sewage or sanitation systems around their own houses on sort of a micro level. They don't get good hospital care, medical care, that sort of thing. All their social services are cut way back. And in the end, they can't pay their debt anyway, and so we economic hitmen go back into the country and say, hey, since you can't pay your debts, you got to strike a deal with us. Sell your oil or whatever the resource is real cheap to our companies without any environmental or social limitations. Vote with us on a critical United Nations vote. Allow us to build a military base on your soil. Those sorts of things. And in the few cases where we fail, the Jackals go in, and these are people who either overthrow governments or assassinate the leaders. I talk in my books about how I failed with the democratically elected president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and also the president of Panama, Omar Torrijos, because I couldn't corrupt them, because I couldn't get them to accept these onerous conditions for their countries. They were assassinated in CIA Assassinations. And in the few cases where the Jackals also fail, such as with Saddam Hussein in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, then and only then does the military go in. Of course, we're seeing a resurgence sort of the military go in because more and more leaders are not accepting these conditions.
Would an example of that be Muammar Qaddafi in Libya?
Interesting case, of course. We've seen a number of them recently. We overthrew President Zelaya, democratically elected president of Honduras. There was the Arab Spring, of course, with Saddam Hussein, and then Qaddafi. And I think although we were told that, that the problem with Qaddafi was oil and possibly siding with people with nuclear weapons, et cetera, the fact of the matter is a lot of what was behind our fear of Qaddafi was the fact that he was suggesting very strongly that he was going to open an oil exchange where he would sell oil for something he called the gold dinar, a new currency, his currency. He had a very large central bank with a lot of gold in it. His currency is backed by gold. And he was suggesting that all the African countries and OPEC countries, Muslim countries, should only use that currency to buy oil, and that would have undercut the U.S. central banking system, the Federal Reserve. It would have undercut our currency around the world. Saddam Hussein had promised to do something similar. And interestingly, now Iran is also making waves as though it might do that. And whenever these leaders take that kind of a stance, it's going to undercut our Federal Reserve and the dollar, we get very upset. So I think that was a major issue with Qaddafi.
Well, why would these leaders even attempt to rebel against the establishment? I mean, they know that guys like you are out there that are going to get in a lot of trouble and going to get taken out.
Well, Russell, most of them don't. Most leaders don't do that. And if you think about the ones that do, they're pretty outrageous characters. So you've got Qaddafi, who you might consider crazy. I mean, I don't know. I don't know the man personally. In the old days, certainly Torrijos was not crazy. He was an amazing human being. I liked him very much, and the same with Roldos of Ecuador. But that wasn't back in the 70s, in the late 70s. Things were a little different back then. But today you've got Saddam Hussein, kind of a very strange character, and Qaddafi. Zelaya in Honduras was not that way. He was a very sane man. but he was a man with great integrity. So you either have to have incredible integrity and maybe figure that your country isn't really important enough for someone to go in. I think Zelaya may have felt that. Or you've got to be, willing to take huge, huge risks, which Qaddafi was always willing to do. Saddam Hussein was always willing to do that. Many of the leaders of some of these Arab countries like Syria have been willing to do that. And so it takes a very special kind of a person to stand up against the system today.
John, you were a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 60s. Tell us how you got into that world and met Omar Torrijos, as you've mentioned. And
well, yeah, when I graduated, my last year in business school in Boston, I was determined not to go to Vietnam. I did not believe in the Vietnam War. And my wife's father was very high up in the U.S. government and had close relationships with the National Security Agency, a person very high up in the National Security Agency, who arranged for me to take tests, including lie detector tests, personality tests. I had a very large barrage of tests that I took and was offered a training program at the National Security Agency. And I was ready to do that, which could have been draft deferrable. But then I heard a Peace Corps recruiter at my university talking, and I was very intrigued. I grew up in rural New Hampshire. I have some Algonquin blood in me, and I was always very, very fascinated by indigenous people and had wanted to go to the Amazon, where I knew that people still live, much as I used to back several hundred years ago in this country. And so I asked the Peace Corps recruiter if that was a possibility, and he said, "My God, if you want to go to the Amazon, I'm sure they'll take you because nobody wants to go there." So I contacted this man high up in the NSA who'd offered me this job, a good family friend, and he very much encouraged me to do it. In fact, he said he would help make sure that it happened because it would be really good training for the National Security Agency. Learn other languages, learn survival techniques, live in the rainforest and the Amazon. I mean, he said this would be very good training. So I did. And while I was there, my last year there, I was contacted by a senior vice president of the company that I would eventually work for, a man named Ina Grieve, who was also high up in the Army Reserve and was a liaison between the intelligence communities, the CIA, the National Security Agency, etc., and the Army Reserve and corporate America. And essentially, he had seen my files, I'm sure, from the National Security, from my interviews with the National Security Agency, and offered me a job at his company, Charles C. Main, where I became chief economist eventually. Had a large staff, and my job at that point was basically as an economic hitman. Once there, I was trained by a woman named Claudine, who I discuss extensively in the books, who let me know what my real job was expected to be. It wasn't at all what the job description said an economist and a chief economist should be doing. My job was really to con presidents and ministers of states and others to do the types of activities that I've just described.
Well, tell me about the art of the hustle. What exactly would you say, or what would be an example of what you would say to one of these dictators?
You know, it's very simple in its essence, and it would take more time than this. Certainly, you'd wine and dine people, you'd hang out, but ultimately, the message was, hey, you know, I can help you and your family and your friends become extremely wealthy if you just sign off on this World Bank loan. We'll see to it that you know, your brother who owns the John Deere franchise gets an incredibly lucrative contract. We'll see to it that your brother-in-law who owns the Coca-Cola franchise sells an awful lot of Coca-Cola to construction workers, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll see to it that you and your friends and family and cronies get really rich out of this. It was essentially a bribe, although when couched in those terms, it's a legal bribe. But it is a bribe. We'll also pay for your kids to go to college in the United States. We'll pay all their expenses. We'll pay all their scholarships, things like that. And then we say, on the other hand, if you don't go along with this, remember what happened to Mossadegh in Iran. Remember what happened to Arbenz in Guatemala. Remember what happened to Lumumba in the Congo and Diem in Vietnam and Allende in Chile. These were all people that we've now admitted on record that were taken down in coups. And all of these presidents know this, and today we can say, remember what happened to Torrijos and Roldos and Qaddafi and Zelaya. And so Anybody sitting at the top of the pyramid in one of these countries gets it pretty quickly. Look, I can either get wealthy and keep my job and maybe do the best I possibly can for my country, or I can get taken out in a coup or assassinated. And, in good conscience, if you're in that position, Russell, you're going to say to yourself, if I get taken out in a coup or assassinated, it's not going to do me any good, but it also means that my successor's going to be scared to death. He's going to be a real puppet, and it's going to serve a notice around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so my best bet is to go ahead, I'll take the bribes, and I'll stay in the office and do the best job I possibly can.
Tell me more about Omar Torrijos. You spent quite a lot of time with him. For those who don't know, he was the de facto leader of Panama.
Yeah, he was a pretty amazing man. Tremendous charisma. I liked him a lot. He was a very strong person who was very much in favor of the people. He came from a relatively poor lower middle class background, and he really favored the people. He also loved life. He loved to dance. He loved to smoke cigars, drink rum and whiskey and et cetera, and party. But he was an incredibly good leader, and he was very, very popular throughout Panama, all of South America, and much of the world, in fact. And one of the things he was very insistent upon was that the Panama Canal go back to be owned by Panamanians. He was incensed by the idea that the United States had this huge colonialistic swath through the middle of his country, the canal, and on either side of the canal, there were 18 golf courses in the canal zone, and the living conditions there were phenomenal. And right out, those were all U.S. citizens who lived there. And right outside of that, on the other side of these barbed wire fences, were extremely poor people in Panama. He hated that. He hated the fact that the School of the Americas was located in Panama. This is a school that trains young men from all over Latin America and some young women these days to become dictators, basically, and to become the servants, the soldiers of dictators. And Omar had been to that school. He'd been a general in the National Guard, and he'd been to that school, and he called it, instead of the School of the Americas, he says it's the School of Assassins, wanted to get it out of the country. He also said, the United States owes my people a lot of money. You took all this land to build this canal. You've made fortunes off us. We need to get repaid, and all of Latin America needs to be repaid for the way you've raped our resources. And he was very adamant about this. He was not a communist. He was not a radical. He was a guy who really looked at the world through very clear glasses and saw a lot of the truth behind the kind of imperialism that we had launched against Latin America. And I have to say right here, Russell, I'm an extremely loyal American. My family goes back to the Revolutionary War. Before the Revolutionary War, I count Ethan Allen and Tom Paine as distant ancestors of mine. And I say all these things because I know my country can do better, and I think a lot of Americans, when they really understand what's going on, how we treat the rest of the world, will be incensed and demand change.
But America has become a corporation.
It has. It's run by corporations. Let's put it that way.
It's a brand, though. It's the brand USA run by corporations.
You're right. Yeah, that's very true, Russell. And of course, we know that the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It's not a U.S. government agency, as many people think. And yeah, the whole country. We've really created this new empire, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first truly global empire in history. And it's not an American empire. It's a corporate empire. And it is, to some degree, based in America. And certainly the American Secret Services and armed forces protect the corporations that are behind this. But the real leaders are what I call the corporatocracy, which are mostly men who run our biggest corporations, the multinationals. This is not a conspiracy theory. These people, many of them, none of them never met each other. They don't get into dark, smoke-filled rooms and plot illegal plans against anybody. But they're all driven by one single goal, and that is to maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. This is a relatively new goal for corporations. It's not what I was taught in business school in the 60s, but it came about in the 70s. Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, expressed it most eloquently, if I dare use that word for such a thing. But they said, unlike previous times when it was said that corporations had a responsibility to serve the public, the new theory is no, corporations only have the responsibility of maximizing profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And all of these corporate managers, what I call the corporatocracy, buy into that theory. And so they all come together to protect anything to protect the policies that support that theory. So if somebody in the legislature suggests something that does not help them maximize profits, they'll all band together. Exxon and Shell may fight for your dollar at the gas pump, and Nike and Reebok may fight for your dollar at the retail store. But believe me, if somebody comes along and suggests a policy that's going to upset the apple cart and their goal of maximizing profits, they'll all march together down the streets of Washington, D.C. with all of their best lobbyists.
John, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in 2 minutes with our guest, John Perkins. We're back with John Perkins. You know, John, when you were talking about Omar Torrijos, it reminded me of that movie Moon Over Parador with Richard Dreyfuss. And I assume that's probably what most people visualize in their head when they think of these people. So when you mentioned Omar Torrijos and the cigar, I thought it was kind of funny.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is that image. And in a way, Omar fit the image. He wore kind of a cowboy hat with one brim up like the old safari movies. But he was,
John Wayne, yeah.
Yeah, but he was anything but that. And I mean, he was an amazingly beautiful, charismatic human being who loved people and was extremely compassionate to people. And it's interesting to me, Russell, that I think in a way the United States, unfortunately, has become the world's biggest banana republic. And I hate to say that, but we are really a mono economy where our budget is hugely biased toward the military. Over 60% of our official budget goes to the military, and much more through spin-off effects and the unofficial budget. We're totally dependent on that as an economy. And also, we have this tremendously corrupt system. It's more corrupt than any other country I've been in many respects, where what we call the revolving door, where a person, can be a CEO of a major company, let's say oil, and the next year can be in charge of the regulatory agency of the U.S. government that regulates oil, and then 3 years later go back to being CEO of an oil company. And that happens in agribusiness, it happens in retail, it happens in everything. And it's incredibly corrupt. It puts people in a position where they have amazing power to control an industry where they have very, very strong self-interest. Frankly, I don't know another country where that sort of thing happens quite so extensively. And you talk about bribes. I mean, every politician in this country is really dependent on huge corporate funding, and then that's essentially a type of legal bribe. I hate to say all this, but it's unfortunately true.
Well, do you think people in government are generally good?
I think it's hard to generalize, of course, but the people in government there's two types. There's the elected officials, and then there's the long-term government employees. I've known a lot in both areas that are incredibly good people and don't understand what's going on. But I have found with most of the elected officials that I've known over the years that they go in with the best of intentions, but very soon they find that they're in extremely compromised positions where they have to take huge amounts of campaign financing from big corporations. And then they're very much very much dependent of those corporations. I'm talking about the national level now. On the local level, it's quite different. And we have a lot of really, really good people, I think, on the local level running our municipalities and some of our states. But the higher up you get, the more the possibility for extreme corruption. And another thing I think it's important for us to recognize that all these senators and Congress people who are constantly fighting against Medicare and Social Security and universal health care, they live in a very socialized world. They get huge salaries for life, and they get incredibly good insurance. They get all the things that they keep telling us the rest of the people should never have.
You've mentioned Jackals. Jackals are essentially the real hitman, not the economic hitman, but they'll kill you.
Right.
So at what risk does a guy like Barack Obama, in this incredibly corrupt country, as you've stated, what risk is he?
Well, what's interesting in the United States today is he's got a huge risk of assassination but probably not physical assassination. Back in Kennedy's day, everybody knew that Jack Kennedy was having affairs with Marilyn Monroe and Angie Dickinson and many other women.
Mm-hmm.
And that was okay, in fact, in a way, because he had a very bad back. He was considered by some people as a cripple, but this sort of gave him a machismo aura. But in any case, you could not bring him down by talking about these things. The only way to bring him down was with a bullet. But things changed over time, and by the time Clinton was president, you could bring a president down. You could impeach a president because of Monica Lewinsky. And that was a major change. And now we know that any president or anybody high in office can easily be taken down by a sex scandal or a drug scandal. And, it doesn't even have to be true.
It's his character assassination.
It's character assassination. And we recently saw the head of the IMF, Strauss-Kahn,
mm-hmm.
for whom I have no sympathy. I don't like the man. I don't like the IMF, so I'm not defending him or the IMF, and I don't know what the truth is.
Yeah, but he was set up. That was obvious.
Well, yeah, I don't know the truth behind it, but what I do know is that his career was destroyed by the accusation of a chambermaid in a hotel. And it may have been totally truthful. I don't know. But the message that would send to Barack Obama and anybody else high in office, any senator, any Congress people, is that all you need is an accusation. And it may be proven false a year or two later, but by then it's too late. So these people know that they're in extremely vulnerable positions.
And we saw that with Herman Cain just recently, too.
Yeah, of course we did. And we've seen it time and time again with various elected officials. And, I'm not defending unethical conduct or sex scandals or anything like that. But what I am saying is that today you don't need to assassinate leaders, at least in the United States, with bullets. You can do it with character assassination. That's not true in many other countries, but it is true here.
So why has no one assassinated you yet, John?
Well, first of all, my book is my best insurance, and any good jackal knows that. So Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and if you take that and Secret History of the American Empire and my most recent book, Hoodwinked, and put them all together, they sold several million copies. Confessions alone has sold over 1 million copies, and it's in 40 different languages. But if somebody assassinated me tonight, the sales would skyrocket. It would be up in the tens of millions. And people who had never heard of the book before will suddenly start buying it. That's the last thing anybody that might want to assassinate me would want to see happen.
Mm-hmm.
So they know that assassinating me is counterproductive.
They'd turn you into a martyr.
Yeah, it would turn me into a martyr.
Mm-hmm.
And character assassination for me, somebody in my position, isn't going to work because nobody elects me. That's probably going to sell more books too. People are going to say, "Oh my God, he's got mistresses and girlfriends, or he's doing drugs." Well, let's read about it. I want to buy the book and read more about it. So that really doesn't work. The other aspect of this, Russell, is that Michael Morris hasn't been assassinated. He's out there running around. There's a lot of other people these days that are writing things and making documentaries. And most of the leaders are very short term. They look at the next quarter, the income statement for the next quarter, or maybe the next year, or the next election, which is never more than a couple of years away. And they don't really see writers or movie makers or people like that as having an immediate effect, which is to some degree true. I think we do have a huge effect, but it takes a little bit of time. The people that they see as dangerous are people like politicians, like certainly Martin Luther King Jr. in his day, and Van Jones today, who has had some character assassination, and others of that type that can get out there and rouse lots and lots of people very, very quickly.
Is America in decline because they have accepted one of these predator loans?
Well,
or a series of them?
Yeah, well, we're certainly in decline. I mean, that's a complex question, Russell, but we've been hit by economic hitmen. There's no question. The scenario that I portrayed before of getting countries to take on huge loans that they can't repay, well, that was done to many individuals in this country when bankers told a guy who could only afford a $300,000 house that he should buy a $500,000 house. And then in a few years, it'd be worth $1 million. So tighten your belt and buy this bigger house and make the loan payments. and then the bottom fell out of the market. Person lost his house totally. The banks got it back. They repackaged it and resold it. And that person who lost his house now is in a position where he's not going to go out on the streets in March. He wants to find another job. He's lost his job, whatever. So he's probably going to toe the line pretty much, although we are seeing some backlash through the Occupy movements. But the United States has really been hit by economic hitmen. You know, what comes around goes around. On the other hand, we're also seeing a situation where we've created a totally failed global economy. The only way you can describe it is a failure. Less than 5% of us live in the United States, and we consume over 25% of the world's resources, while roughly half the world is starving or on the verge of starvation. That's a failed system. You can't repeat it in Africa or Latin America, China, India. These countries may want to replicate what we've done, but they can't. You know, you need another 5 planets without any people, with all our resources to make that happen. That's just do the math, you know.
But from the perspective of the United States, it's a success.
Well, from the perspective of that 1%, the famous 1%, it's a success. But from the perspective of most of the rest of us, it's failing. Our lives are pretty tough these days. Our systems are collapsing. There's lots of talk of getting rid of Social Security and Medicare, and we don't have general insurance, universal health insurance. We really don't have a very good system here at all. We've got a few people making a tremendous amount of money, and we've got the rest of us. And if you consider that this is probably, from a statistical standpoint, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, you can also say that it's perhaps the least happy. If you look at our social statistics, you look at things like homicide rates and suicide rates and drug abuse and child abuse, family beatings and divorce and so on and so forth, you see that our rates are extremely high in all those negative elements. So what we've learned is that this type of a system doesn't buy us happiness. It doesn't buy us truly good living standards.
But yet you continue to live in the United States. As you said, you love your country.
I love my country, and I feel that my job is here. You know, talking to you on the station and traveling across the United States. I speak at a lot of universities. I speak at a lot of MBA programs. I also travel a lot internationally. I just got back from Istanbul. I'm headed back to the Middle East in 2 months. I was recently in China and in Iceland, and I go to Latin America a lot, and I'm headed off to Europe soon, and England, and I lecture in all these places. So I want to reach the whole world. But the United States is still the leader. We're looked upon as that. English is the main language of commerce and diplomacy, and our media and our movies and our songs and everything reaches so many people. People look to us. This is a really wonderful time for us to exhibit our true leadership ability, but let's lead the world into a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. You know, I think if we can just turn that goal of corporations around, the goal of maximizing profits regardless of social and environmental costs, and tell the corporations, hey, listen, go ahead and make decent profits, pay your investors a decent rate of return, but realize that you've got to do this within the limitations of creating a good world for my grandson. You've got to do this within the limitations of creating a sustainable world, a just world, a world where all people can thrive. Let's set some new limits around this. Let's talk about corporations serving a public interest. And incidentally, we have a precedent for this. During the first 100 years the United States was a country, no corporation could get a charter in any state unless it proved it was going to serve a public interest. And charters lasted on average 10 years. And then the company had to go back and prove that it had served a public interest and would continue to do so. That was all done away with in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court decided that corporations had the rights but not the responsibilities of individuals.
John, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in a couple minutes here with John Perkins.
There's a man with
We're back with John Perkins. John, you've presented a lot of problems, and I believe in what you're saying with this economic hitman stuff. Are there any solutions? Do you have any ideas that can help us get out from under the thumb of these loans?
Yes, Russell, I'm extremely encouraged by what is going on. I'm very, very hopeful. I think that, the good news is that this empire is really a corporate empire. So if we look at history, we see that a few hundred years ago, the world was pretty much run by religious organizations. And then governments took over. We went from city-states to nation-states. And some of these governments were democratic, and some were totalitarian, some were republics, whatever. But in recent years, what we've seen is that the nations have become rather emasculated, and it's the big corporations that are calling the shots. So a few years ago, we might have looked at the globe when I was in college, for example. Look at the globe of roughly 200 countries, of which a few had a lot of power: Soviet Union, the United Kingdom at times, the United States. But today we might rather look at this globe as still roughly 200 countries, but huge clouds drifting around it. These are the big corporations. They know no national borders, really. They don't follow any specific sets of laws. But the good news is that they are dependent on us to buy their goods and services. And the marketplace is truly democratic if we decide to look at it as such, and we really haven't very much. But every time we buy something or decide not to, we're casting a ballot. And I think it's really more important than the ballot we cast on election day every 2 years or 4 years or whatever, because we're just casting this ballot all the time, and we're voting for the true powers. And so, if we decide not to buy something that's made, let's say, by Nike, because we know they've got slaves working for them in sweatshops in Indonesia, and we send an email to Nike and tell them why we're not buying it, and we send an email to the company we choose to buy from that is trying to be more socially conscious, we're casting an important vote. And throughout history, this vote has been extremely important. And if I go back to my college years, there was apartheid in South Africa. We boycotted corporations that supported apartheid and pretty much got rid of it. Rivers in the United States, the Charles River in Boston, where I was going to school, was terribly polluted. You couldn't walk beside it. It smelled so foul. Rivers in Ohio were on fire with pollution. We got corporations to clean them up. We got corporations to open their doors wider to women and minorities. We got them to get rid of trans fats in foods more recently, and to label food products according to calories and nutrition. So we had a tremendous impact. The corporations listened to us. And I think it's time now to take this to a new level and say, hey, we're not just going to go after aerosol cans or destroying the ozone layer or apartheid or various things like that. We're going to go after the whole overall concept here. We're only going to buy from corporations that are committed to creating a better world for our kids and our grandchildren. We're only going to buy from corporations that, go ahead and make a decent return for your investors, but do so only within the context of creating a socially just and environmentally sustainable world, and a world where all people can prosper. And if we do that, if enough of us do that, and we send this message out loud and clear, it's going to happen. And in fact, we're seeing it happening. We're seeing every major company out there now is at least having to say that it wants to be greener, socially and environmentally. Some people will say, well, they're just greenwashing. And my response to that is, that may be, but greenwashing is at least admitting you have a problem. It's the first step. It's like the 12-step program. The first step is becoming aware, admitting you got a problem.
Sorry, what is greenwashing?
Well, it's the equivalent of whitewashing. It means that you're saying you're going to be greener, but in fact you really don't intend to be.
Okay.
So some people have said that Walmart is making waves that's sounding greener, sounding more socially and environmentally conscious, but it's just greenwashing. It's just covering up. And my response is, well, that is the first step, but let's push them harder. Push harder and harder and harder. We, the people, have the power, and we're the only ones who do. We've talked earlier about how presidents and our elected officials are extremely vulnerable, and they're highly dependent on corporations for their campaign financing, and plus the corporations control the mainstream media. So, but we, the people, have the power. And part of the problem is that in the past we've sent very strong messages to corporations. Well, let's face it, the corporations are just us. We work for the corporations. We buy from them. But we've sent these messages that, hey, I want inexpensive T-shirts, and if that means they have to be made by slaves in sweatshops, I'll just look the other way. I want inexpensive petroleum gas for my car. If that means destroying the Amazon rainforest and the deserts of the Middle East, I'll just look the other way. Well, it's time that we, the people, send another message, and that is that we want a world that is socially and environmentally good, healthy, conscious, a world that our children will want to grow up in. And that means, for the first time in history, the only way my 4.5-year-old grandson can hope to inherit a really good, livable world is if every child on the planet inherits that same world. And this is brand new. It used to be we only needed to worry about taking care of our own country. But today we understand that the only way our children are going to have a good world in this highly integrated, highly interconnected world is if every child in Botswana and Bolivia and Indonesia and Palestine and Israel also has a good world. This is brand new, Russell, but it's time we really understood this. And we understand that the power base around all of this is the corporations, but they are dependent upon us.
Well, wouldn't that mean that the standard of living in the United States would have to go down, to accommodate, say, the standard of living in Africa to go up?
Not at all. I think the standard of living, the real true standard of living in the United States would go up if we did this. For one thing, it would do away with a lot of this unrest around the world, the wars, what we call terrorism. So much of this stems from desperation and poverty. There are always leaders like, bin Laden, who comes from a very wealthy family and he's a fanatic.
Mm-hmm.
But these leaders don't get followings. They don't get massive followings unless there's a lot of unhappy, angry people. I've seen this over and over. I've interviewed members of FARC, the revolutionary group in Colombia, and Somali pirates, and members of Al-Qaeda. And every one of the people I've interviewed, they don't want to be in those jobs. Those are dangerous jobs. These are starving fishermen in the case of Somali pirates, campesinos in the case of FARC, who lost their lands, lost the fish. The fish have been fished out of their waters or destroyed by pollution, and they're desperate to feed their children. And so along comes a bin Laden or someone like this, and they buy into it because they don't know what else to do. And once you've picked up that gun, you're now branded for the rest of your life as a terrorist. If we raised the standard of living of all these people around the world, we'd have a lot fewer problems. We'd be happier. And let's again remember that there is that 1% in this country that makes most of the money here. So our standard of living, yours and mine, and the people listening to this program wouldn't have to go down. It would be nice if that 1% would, get rid of a few of their yachts and their penthouses and their 24 houses, and shared some of that wealth with others. And I'm not a communist by any means. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the pragmatism of capitalism, which I totally believe in, and of democracy and fairness.
You mentioned 1%, which is, of course, an allusion to the Occupy movement's 99%. We are the 99%. Do you agree with this Occupy movement?
I think the Occupy movement is incredibly important. It's spoken out loud and clear, and it's been heard. And it now seems to be moving into a new phase where it's going to capitals, and it's trying to get its message across. It's a very loose movement, so it's hard to say whether you agree with it or disagree with it because there's so many different elements to it. I've spoken at several of their events. I've been told that my book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, has served as a field guide to many of the Occupy movements. And I've been very impressed by a lot of the people in this movement. There are also drug addicts, there's no question. There are homeless people who've been wandering the streets for years and now finding free food, and they wander in and out of these places. But behind all of that is this belief that the system is bad and that it can't go on like this. And I've seen the same thing in the Middle East. And as I mentioned, I was there recently, the Arab Spring. We've seen a huge revolution in Latin America where 10 countries representing more than 80% of the population of South America recently voted in presidents who are standing up to these corporations. They're saying, hey, you can't exploit our lands and our people anymore. If you want to be here in Bolivia or Chile or Ecuador or Brazil or wherever, then you've got to behave more responsibly. And every one of these 10 countries that recently has democratically voted in these new leaders, every one of these 10 countries during most of my lifetime was run by brutal dictators, put into power by the CIA and kept there. I speak Spanish fluently. I travel a lot in Latin America. It's amazing what's happened down there. So we're seeing a worldwide movement. We're seeing now Russia. The Russian people are standing up to Putin. We're seeing it in China. We're seeing it all over. The people are beginning to get it, Russell, and I think this is extremely important. And the Occupy movement is one symbol of that. It's more than a symbol. It's a movement. And it's evolving, certainly, and it has its share of problems and issues. But the fact is, it's people coming together to speak out and saying, hey, you know, the system that we've created is not working. We need something new. We need to change it.
I don't have a lot of faith in the government's ability. So when you look at the Greece problem and people are rioting in the streets, their answer is more police control, and that's going to be the answer in the United States. It just moves it to a police state. Now you have another problem.
Well, that may be, and you know, people get very incensed by the idea of a police state, as I do, and so when we see people in the Occupy movement or people in Greece or Italy or wherever being billy clubbed by policemen, we all get very incensed. And that's probably a good thing. I mean, not that people are being beaten, but that we're getting incensed. Sometimes that's what it takes. I'm old enough to remember the anti-Vietnam movement, and the thing that made it strongest was when the police really started attacking people. And when the National Guard shot those students at Kent State. Sometimes it takes that sort of thing. It's tragic, it's unfortunate. But sometimes that's what it takes to really get the people to understand that we can't put up with this any longer. So I think we may be seeing something like that coming. We also know that when the police start to move like they have been, that's telling us that we're picking up strength, because they don't do that unless they feel threatened. And the police are just, you know, puppets of the corporatocracy, but the corporatocracy doesn't send in its puppet police officers unless it's feeling really threatened. And that's good news, that they're feeling threatened. They should feel threatened. It means that we're making headway. This program is reaching people. My books and a lot of books and movies and documentaries are reaching people. They're being heard. And people around the world are rising up and speaking out. And I think there's something extremely encouraging about that. You know, what we really need to do at this point is create a new economy. So I've talked about how we as the consumer have a lot of power to influence corporations. One of the ways that we need to influence these corporations and our government to support corporations is to get behind the idea that we don't need any more weapons. Let's get out of this military budget mentality. Let's get out of the idea that our tax dollars are just going to go to creating things that are going to kill people. And let's instead pay the same companies, you know, General Dynamics, General Motors, General Electric, all the generals out there. Let's pay them to, instead of making weapons, to make equipment that will clean up the terribly polluted water and earth and air of this planet. Every country suffers from terrible pollution. Let's clean it up. That can contribute hugely to economic growth. And let's pay companies like Monsanto and the big agribusiness companies to, instead of promoting crops that ultimately destroy the soil and require Monsanto's pesticides and insecticides and fertilizers, let's instead get these companies to come up with ways that starving people in Africa and elsewhere can better grow food more efficiently and store it and distribute it in better ways. There's a huge economy out there that's waiting to happen, an economy that's based on creating a sustainable and just life and a prosperous life for everybody on this planet. We can do this. You know, just divert our tax dollars from military to creating things that enhance life, and not just paying the big companies to do this, but also encouraging entrepreneurs. It's a huge number of entrepreneurs I run into, young people coming out of college who want to start their own companies to, produce solar panels better. That's the other huge area that we talk about a lot, more sustainable energy. And we also need better transportation systems, communication systems. There's so much to be done. There's such an economy out there waiting to happen. Move out of the military and into things that really help enhance life.
John, we'll be back after this break for our final segment. We're back with John Perkins for this final segment. John, brilliant show. You're talking about the economy and how we have to create a new world economy. Do you have any interest or do you believe in the ideas of the resource-based economy?
Yes, I do. You want to define that a little better, Russell? For some people may not know what we're talking about here.
Well, we've done a show with Jacques Fresco only 3 weeks ago. And Matt Berkowitz from Zeitgeist Vancouver is a regular on this show. So I feel that my audience is educated enough to understand what the resource-based economy is.
Well, yeah, and I think that along with that goes the creation of a whole new type of currency. Is that part of what you've been talking about?
No. We have not been talking about the creation of a new currency. Of course, on a lot of the talk shows, when they talk about a new world currency, they tie that in with a new world government, a new world order, the Illuminati, Freemasonry. It freaks everybody out.
Yeah, no, what I'm talking about is a currency that's really based on resources. And rather than being based on a Federal Reserve system like ours, which is a private reserve system that is totally dependent on debt, basically the creation of money out of thin air and putting everybody in debt over it, we're talking about a currency here that's really based on resources and those contribution to those resources, so that housewife's work and taking care of babies is as important as the work of a guy outside cutting down trees, and you can assign a value to each of those, and you base your currency on that. So you really get your currency tied in with the resources, including the human resources.
Okay, explain further.
Well, okay, so let's say that I'm the guy cutting down the trees out there, and for me to cut down a tree and cut it up and, put it in a cord for you, I would say is worth, let's say, $200. Mm-hmm. And a woman taking care of babies and cleaning the house and so on and so forth, let's say over a period of 2 days, would be the equivalent of $2. That's $200, let's say, for both. So with the computer system, I can just go on record as my cutting this tree is worth $200, and she puts her $200 for taking care of the house and the baby and cleaning up, and that's worth $200. Now we've each got this $200, and we can go down to the local grocery store and go in and pick out products that are worth $200, and they will accept this currency that's based on our $200. And it's all done through a computer. These days you can do it through a computer. The original use of money was actually in that sort of form. The reason we call a dollar a buck is because back a couple hundred years ago, a buck skin, when you killed a deer and took its skin, that was worth the equivalent of a dollar bill back in those days. And so rather than having to take your buckskin, the actual skin of an animal, to the local baker and exchange animal skins for loaves of bread, you took it to a slaughter. You took it to someplace else, and they gave you this piece of paper that said, "Hey, this is worth $1," and then you could take that buck down to the bakery and buy $1 worth of bread. We moved away from that through the Federal Reserve System that then created money, essentially, and it creates it all based on debt. But so the idea of this resource-based currency is one where you go back to that kind of a standard. And it's happening in many different communities in the United States. Ecuador is taking a leadership role in that in many regards and looking at doing it on a national level. So it's a very fascinating new approach to currency. And, of course, it takes the power out of the Federal Reserve.
I believe there was someone in the United States who started creating these Liberty dollars. They were gold coins, and they seized his entire inventory because they were saying he was essentially creating a counterfeit currency or trying to circumvent the current system.
Wow, yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular...
Yeah, the government doesn't take too kindly to you trying to create your own currency system.
No, but communities are doing it, and no, you know, as I said earlier, that's probably what brought Qaddafi down, and one of the reasons we went after Saddam Hussein, and now we're making ways to go to war with Iran, which would be a terrible mistake, incidentally. I hope that doesn't happen, but it looks like we're pushing that issue pretty strongly.
So, as an economic hitman, how would you bribe someone? Like, you don't physically bring in a suitcase full of cash, do you?
Never. I never did anything illegal. Well, I guess I cheated on a few expense accounts to get some extra cash once in a while. But no, we had very strict policies against that kind of bribery, handing money under the table. But what I would do is go into some important person and say, hey, your brother owns, as I said earlier, for example, the John Deere franchise. And if we get this loan from the bank, if your country gets this loan from the bank and hires my company to build this big hydroelectric site, we'll pay double what you normally get paid, what your brother normally gets paid to franchise out that equipment. And there's nothing illegal about doing that. There's nothing illegal about paying $2 million for renting equipment that should probably have only cost you $1 million. Who's going to question that? There's nothing illegal about making a bad deal, but somebody's making a windfall profit off that. And the other thing we'll say is, we're going to pay for your 3 sons and 2 daughters to go to college in the United States. We're going to make sure that they get into good schools. We can make that happen. We'll give them full scholarships. We'll pay for their airfare and their living expenses, and we'll give them part-time jobs and summer jobs in our company, and during vacations they can come and work for us, and we'll pay them good salaries at that time. Nothing illegal about that. In fact, my company, Charles T. Main, we did that a lot, and we bragged about it. We went public with the idea that we were supporting kids from Iran and Indonesia and Colombia and Panama, bringing them to college, giving them scholarships, giving them free room and board, giving them work. What we never said was the only ones that we supported were the sons and daughters of very important politicians in those countries. We didn't do that for the poor people, but we didn't bother to say that. Nobody ever asked. It looked really good, but it was a bribe. That's a bribe. It's worth a heck of a lot of money.
But if they didn't take this money, the Jackals would come in. What proof do you have, or why is it that you truly believe that these people were killed? In the case of Torrijos, he died in a plane crash. But
yes, in every bit of evidence, in both the case of Torrijos and Roldos, both died in the same kind of plane and the same kind of a crash 3 months apart from each other. Mm-hmm. And the scenes of the crashes were sealed off, and only the U.S. military and their military counterparts from those countries were allowed in. In the case of Ecuador, even the local police weren't allowed in. The motors, the jet engine from one of the planes from the plane in Ecuador was sent to a Swiss lab, and they said it did not stop when it hit the mountain. It stopped before then. And that's why it hit the mountain, because the engine wasn't running. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of evidence. There were 3 in the case of Ecuador. There were 3 key witnesses to what had happened that showed that the plane did not go down in a storm. And every one of them died in very strange accidents. There's so much pointing in that direction, plus the fact that I and other people were expecting it. We figured that Roldos and then Torrijos would go down if they didn't toe the line. After Roldos was assassinated, Torrijos called his family together, and he said, hey, I'll be next. But don't worry about it. If it happens, when it happens, because I did win the Panama Canal back. He signed a treaty with Jimmy Carter and get the canal back in the hands of the people. And he said, I get the School of the Americas out of here. I've accomplished what I needed to do. So if they kill me or when they kill me, don't worry about it. He was expecting it. And the other thing is, Russell, we've admitted, Henry Kissinger's admitted to his role in the CIA's role taking out Allende in Chile. We've admitted to sending in the military and the CIA to take out Arbenz in Guatemala. And we've admitted to our role with Diem in Vietnam and Mossadegh in Iran. We've admitted to these things. So there's no question here. Roldos and Torrijos we have not yet admitted to. Statute of limitations hasn't gone up for those two yet.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't admitted.
And it's quite the people that we replace these fallen leaders with. In the case of Muammar Gaddafi, you have Al-Qaeda essentially running Libya. In Panama's case, it went to Manuel Noriega.
Yeah, who was our puppet at the time, and then he defied us. Ultimately, we thought he was our puppet. He defied us, and we took him down too, and then truly replaced him with a puppet. In the case of Roldos, he was replaced by a very strong U.S. puppet. In the case of Allende in Chile, he was replaced by Pinochet, the terrible general whose followers are currently on trial, many of them, and losing those trials. Terribly brutal dictatorship, Pinochet. And Henry Kissinger has admitted that he put Pinochet in power because Pinochet supported our policies. Allende did not. We've seen this over and over again. In the case of Iran, Mossadegh was taken out and replaced by the Shah of Iran, who was a huge friend to the United States and our oil companies and our puppet. We've seen this time and time again, Russell. It's something that every American should stand up and shout about. There's nothing to be proud about the things that we've done in these countries. And rather than being ashamed, let's just change it. Let's not let it happen anymore.
Mm-hmm. And who's left? Kim Jong-il died recently, and of course Qaddafi. Who's out there that's would be seen as a rogue?
Well, certainly Chavez in Venezuela is seen as a rogue.
He's got terminal cancer, so he doesn't have long left.
Yeah, we don't know exactly what his situation is, but we've gone after Correa of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who's a personal favorite of mine, has a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois. He knows what's going on. Tried to take him out in a coup about a year ago, but it was a failed coup, and I think it was intentionally failed. I think the CIA couldn't have botched it quite as badly as they did, and it served a huge notice on Correa. And he had been taking a very strong stance against oil companies and gold mining companies and other extraction companies. And suddenly, after this failed coup, he withstood the coup, but he's changed tremendously since then. He's made a lot more compromises. I think he really got the message. And you'd also seen Zelaya in Honduras taken out shortly before the coup against him. So so he's come around. So frankly, I don't think there's too many left now. We've got some of the Middle Eastern people in Syria and so forth that are still there. You mentioned North Korea. Iran is the big one. That's the one that we're posturing against now. And Iran now is threatening to close down the Straits of Hormuz, where roughly 40% of the world's oil passes through there. If they close down the Straits of Hormuz, which they can do, I helped build a military base at Hormuz back in the 70s when I was an economic hitman. I helped to finance it. I was down there. I watched the space being built. It's an extremely hot place. It's one of the hottest places on the planet, I think. And we built this huge military base down there to protect the Shah. Now this military base that we built is in the hands of what we consider our enemies who are running around today, and they can stop any ship that they want from going through the Straits of Hormuz. And 40% of the world's oil goes through there. A U.S. aircraft carrier went out of there a few days ago, and Iran has sent out the notice that it better not come back. They will not allow it to come back through the Straits. They'll destroy it, and they have the capability to do that, no question about it.
No, I think we've all accepted that Iran is just a matter of time.
Yes, and I think that's a huge mistake because it's a war we really can't win, I think. They can close down the Straits of Hormuz. They can wreak havoc on oil markets. And we've seen, in fact, that we don't win very many wars these days. We didn't win Vietnam. It's pretty hard to claim that we won in Iraq. The big corporations won in all those places. And if we go to war with Iran, once again, the big corporations will get rich off of all of this. And they'll be selling arms to both sides. But we, the people, will ultimately suffer.
Has the government ever responded to your claims directly?
Yes, they have. They posted, and I think it's still there, the State Department has posted a misinformation blog. And the only last I looked, from a couple of years, the only thing on that blog was Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
That's quite a compliment.
Yeah, it's a great comment. It sold a lot of books. It really did. It was totally counterproductive. And I think they knew that, but I think they had no choice. And I tell you what I think happened. Because I was very popular on a TV show in Athens, Greece. One year, the TV crew came over from the equivalent, I've told, of 60 Minutes in Greece and interviewed me here in the United States. It was a very, very popular show. They came back for 2 years after that and then took me on a trip to Ecuador where they made a film called Apology of an Economic Hitman with me. They took me to Ecuador. So I was very popular on the show, but the producer and the host, the second year he came to interview me in the United States, he said, and that's when this blog had come out, this misinformation blog, and he said, I know why that happened. He said, he was called into the U.S. ambassador's office after he did the show on me, and the ambassador chewed him out for showing me, and he said, you put me in an extremely embarrassing position. This is the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Greece speaking. You put me in an extremely embarrassing situation because people come in here and they say to me, so have you read this book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and what do you think about it? Is it true? What's the official policy on this? And he said, I don't know what to answer. So I think what happened is that occurred to a number of ambassadors around the world, and they pressured the State Department to come out with an official statement so they would have something they could say in response. And so the State Department puts up this website, this blog, and so these ambassadors around the world can just say, well, here's the official position. Go to it. But the premise of the blog was that I must not be telling the truth because I claim that the National Security Agency interviewed me and offered me a job, which there's no question they did. Anybody can go back to their records and see that they did. But according to this website, the State Department, there's no way that the National Security Agency would have done that because, as their mission statement says, all they do is cryptography, encoding and decoding messages around the world. Now, we all know that isn't true. We all know that the National Security Agency has been deeply involved in tapping the telephones of U.S. citizens. That's become public record. We know that they own the Pueblo, the ship that was shot down as a spy ship. We know that they've owned spy satellites and drones. This is all public information. So their official mission statement is a subterfuge. It's not correct. And so to base, a misinformation blog on something like that is just outrageous. But I will say I'm grateful because it's sold a lot of books.
Has it effectively blacklisted you from mainstream media, or have you ever really been welcome?
No, I've never been really welcome on big mainstream media. I've been on MSNBC and CNBC and CNN a little bit, but not in any really big format sort of way. So I think it has been successful that way. Not that it has. It's that the mainstream media is owned by the people that I criticize, and of course also their advertising comes from the big corporations that I criticize. But I will say that I've been asked to speak at most of the major MBA programs. I've spoken to CEOs and CFOs of huge corporations. I was in Istanbul about 2 months ago speaking to 4,000 heads of communications industries around the world, and I'm going back in a couple of months from now and speaking to a huge conference of the CEOs and CFOs of the big trading companies. So a lot of businessmen are really listening to me. A lot of business school students are listening, and I'm grateful. I feel blessed to be able to get this message out because I think what we must do now is create a better world. And we've got to do it through corporations, in my opinion. We've got to bring these corporations around, understand that they're just people like you and me. We buy from them, we work for them, and we just have to create an atmosphere that says, hey, make a profit, but only within the context of being socially and environmentally responsible, only within the context of serving the public interest. Corporations must serve the public interest.
But I don't agree with this carbon credit stuff. That's an easy thing for people to say. Well, if we just give some tax dollars, you'll take care of all the problems. Well,
sure, carbon credits are covering up the real problem. I mean, you basically, it's a buyout, isn't it?
Yeah.
Keep doing bad stuff and just pay a fine, basically, is what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. It's not the ultimate answer by any means. It may be a short-term solution that pushes people toward the right answer, but in the long run, the answer has to be to get rid of industries that produce carbon, or find ways to really reduce the amount of carbon that they produce. And again, we the people can do this. Florida Power and Light, one of the nation's largest utility companies, was going to build a big coal plant. The head of their environmental department, their permitting department, said that she would not permit that plant. She could fire her. She happened to be my wife, so I know the story well. When it took Perkins, I have a great admiration for her. She almost lost her job. But because of that, and because the people of Florida would not permit the plant, no community would allow this plant to be built in their backyard. Florida Power and Light never built the plant. Instead, they turned to solar and wind. They are now the largest developer in the United States of solar and wind. Their CEO used to go to Washington about once a month and lobby against any limitations on carbon dioxide back when they were going to build a coal plant. Now he goes to Washington frequently and lobbies for such controls on CO2 because he's in the other business now of producing energy without CO2 emissions. So the people of Florida, and I also think that if my wife had agreed to try to permit that plant, she might have got it through because she's very good at her job. But in any case, the people of Florida spoke out loud and clear, and they turned one of the nation's largest utility companies completely around. So it had been a proponent of it had been against any laws that would limit CO2 emissions, and now is a proponent of such laws. We, the people, we have the power. We have to keep doing this.
Mm-hmm. But it has to be in the hands of responsible corporations. So Solyndra was given, what, $500 million by the U.S. government?
Of course, but mistakes are always going to be made, and nobody's perfect,
mm-hmm.
and we have to move on, and not say that the idea of producing solar energy is wrong because one company lacked integrity or good management or whatever it was. We have to move beyond that and say, hey, mistakes were made, but we've got to move back into an area where we're creating an economy that is oriented toward getting rid of pollution rather than creating more pollution. It's oriented toward getting rid of producing weapons to kill people and oriented toward producing food and shelter and clothing for people who desperately need it.
John, as an economist, how do you see 2012 playing out? Mayan prophecies aside.
Well, I think, as I say, I go into great detail in the book Hoodwinked, my most recent book, which is now out in paperback. And incidentally, I'd just like to mention that people can go to my website, johnperkins.org, and sign up for my newsletter, which comes out about twice a month. And I'm on Facebook, and I'd love to keep in touch with your listeners. But I think, the short-term and the long-term prediction is that we're not going to go back to normal because normal is a catastrophe. Normal is this world where less than 5% of us consume more than 25% of the world's resources, while so many people starve. We don't want to go back to that. So this economy is going to keep failing and because it's a failed system until we come up with a new solution, a new economy, an economy that's based on creating a just, sustainable, and peaceful world, an economy that's based on social and environmental responsibility, an economy that's based on cleaning up pollution and getting rid of the military spending, and really moving toward things that are totally viable and that will make this a better world for all of our children and grandchildren. Until we really take that seriously, we're going to be in economic decline.
Your book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, was a runaway bestseller. It's been printed in many different languages. And your latest book, Hoodwinked, how's that one doing?
It's doing really well. It's not on the same level as Confessions, and nobody expected it to be. But in some respects, I think it's a better book. And it came out in hardback about 2 years ago, and it makes all these predictions of what's going to happen in the economy, and unfortunately, they've all come true. and they're continuing to come true. I mean, I'm happy for the fact that I was such a good forecaster, but I'm unhappy that, the doom and gloom that I foresaw is happening. But on the other hand, the book presents 5 huge categories of where every one of your listeners can participate to create change. And they can pick any one of those categories or any of the subcategories within those categories and focus on any one of those areas. I don't have time to go into them all here now, but they're in the book, and it really is it's a guideline for how each and every one of us can participate in making a better world for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren.
And this is a major book. People can go down to their local chapters and pick up a copy of Hoodwinked by John Perkins, no problem.
Right, or online. It's published by Random House, and they actually commissioned me to write a book that would look at the deep causes of the current economic crisis.
So they're coming to you now. You don't even have to sell the book company.
What a change that is. Yeah.
Well, John, I really have appreciated your time, and thank you very much for being on the West Coast Truth.
My pleasure, Russell. I appreciate what you're doing, and please keep up your good work. You're fighting for freedom of the press, and I admire what you do. Thank you.